today living in labor camps. Kim Jong-un despises Christians. I could go on, but I think you get the point. How are you and I to respond to a culture like this? What are we to do? Here are a couple of possibilities. We could blend in. Just blend in. Just keep a low profile. Remain silent about God. If we need to compromise our convictions to keep from standing out, we could just do that. No need to put a target on our back. Just kind of blend in. But if I read this book right, I don't think Jesus calls us to blend in. Here's another way to respond to this hostile culture. We could just despair. Just watch the news and conclude that God has turned his back. He's placed himself somehow on the inactive roster, and he is allowing evil to run rampant. We could allow ourselves to believe that the world is like a runaway train and there's no one at the controls. We could despair. But that doesn't mesh with this book either. And that is also no way to live. So if blending in is not on the table, if despairing is not a good way to live, how should we live? How should you and I conduct ourselves in a world, in a nation, in our schools, in our workplace that defies God? I invite you to open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 5, and this chapter will give us help answering that relevant question. Daniel chapter 5. Our passage this morning gives us two answers to our question. Here is the first. We are to trust that God will humble the proud in his time. We are to trust that God will humble the proud in his time. I see this spelled out in black and white in the verse right above chapter 5, right before that. Kind of sets up this chapter. It reads, "Those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." That verse tells us that God's quite capable of dealing with those who oppose him, from the schoolyard bully to Kim Jong-un and everyone in between. So we don't need to blend in. We definitely don't need to despair. Rather, we need to trust that God will humble the proud in his time. Chapter 5 illustrates that truth. Reading chapter 5 of the book of Daniel, verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Stop there. The date is October 11th, 539 BC. Belshazzar, a descendant of King Nebuchadnezzar, whom we've already talked about in this book, is throwing a lavish party. In the ballroom of his royal palace, 1,000 of the who's who in Babylon are enjoying a decadent, sensuous evening. Tables laden with shrimp cocktail and ribs and brisket and sushi and chips and salsa. There's a live band blaring away, ice sculptures dancing, scantily clad women, and an endless river of wine. Bob, I commend your parents for not letting you attend that evening, you know? That was good parenting, good parenting. On one hand, it is surprising that Belshazzar would throw a party on that evening, because outside the walls of his city that very night was the army of the Medes and the Persians. That army had already won some skirmishes outside of those walls. They are now intent on getting inside those walls. As this party was going on, Babylon was literally under siege from a formidable foe. It doesn't seem like the best time for a banquet. However, Belshazzar felt otherwise. In his mind, this was the perfect time to celebrate, because he believed that Babylon was invincible. And he had good reason to think that. He really did. That massive city, the largest city in the world at that time, was surrounded by not one wall, not two walls, three walls. And that outer wall was wide enough for chariot races to be run on the top. And outside of that outer wall was a deep moat. It probably had alligators in it or something like that. In addition, there were couple of hundred towers on the top of that wall used for military protection. For 1,000 years, no one had ever breached those walls. What better way to show that off than to throw a party? That Persian army could starve to death before one Persian soldier stepped foot in that city. Belshazzar was boasting to those 1,000 guests and to all those soldiers outside, "Nobody can touch me." It was at the height of this raucous, inebriated celebration that King Belshazzar has an idea. It is a bold, cocky, stupid idea. He thought of a way to elevate himself even more. Let's read about that. Verse 2. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. Stop there. It was customary for conquering rulers to take idols from the conquered people and to place them into the temple of their own gods. Since the Jews had no idols, King Nebuchadnezzar, many years before, had taken the gold and silver vessels used in that temple and carted them off to his city. Doing that was a declaration of the superiority of his gods and the weakness of the conquered God. Those vessels, some 5,000 of them, had remained in storage for 60 years. But on this night, Belshazzar decided to take them out of storage for the sole purpose of belittling God and elevating the gods of the Babylonians and the king himself. Belshazzar is mocking God. This is like somebody tearing out the pages of this book and using them to blow their nose. This is awful. But believe it or not, it gets worse. Belshazzar decides to lead them in a toast. And so they all raised their glasses, verse 4, and they drank wine. As they drank wine, they praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Belshazzar was using the goblets, the vessels of the living God, to praise the dead gods whom he believed were protecting him from the army outside his gate. How dumb can anyone get? Our God overwhelmingly is slow to anger, but every now and then somebody comes along who lights that fuse. And Belshazzar was one of those guys. He was asking for it. You've probably been to a party at some point in your life where everything's going right, and then something happens and the party just dies. Maybe your Aunt Louise gets asthma or something, and call the ambulance, stop the music. Or a couple people get into an argument, it makes everybody uncomfortable. The guests just leave, party's over. I'm guessing you have. But I'm certain that none of you have seen what happens at this party to shut this thing down. Reading. While they were drinking. You ready? Verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand of the royal palace. The king watched as it wrote. His face turned pale. He was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. a detached human hand. That is a bit ghastly. This week, I managed to secure, I have connections in that part, secure an actual photograph of that event. So let's take a look at that on the screen here. Got it, Chris? Okay, got it. Is it coming? Oh, there we are. Okay, there's that hand. All right. Belshazzar used his hand to raise a toast to his false gods. The living God responded by using his hand to bring a little message to this foolish king. That's the end of that party. Thank you. But the message was indecipherable. You've heard the idiom, the handwriting on the wall. It comes from this story. And whenever that phrase is used, it's never referring to something good. It's not saying something good is going to happen. If somebody sees the handwriting on the wall, it might mean your business you're about to lose your business, or the handwriting is on the wall, you're about to lose your hair, or something like that. It always is used of impending doom. And Belshazzar sensed that. He figured out that God wasn't dropping by to say, season's greetings or write, for he's a jolly good fellow. But he couldn't read it. He couldn't read it. He had to know, what did that message mean? We read verse 7, the king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, diviners to be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around his neck. He will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. This king is physically crippled with fear. Who can read this writing? Is there anyone who can tell us what this means? The queen hears of this. And lo and behold, she remembers that there is such a man in Babylon. He's an old man now. He's 80 years old. He's a Jew. He's one of the many who were taken captive. He's a man who at one point held a high position in the government but has now been forgotten. The queen says, call for that man. Call for Daniel. And he will tell you what it means. We read verse 13. So Daniel was brought before the king. Verse 16, the king says to him, now I've heard that you were able to give interpretation to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around your neck. You will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourselves and give them to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. What irony. This mighty king is now groveling to a Jewish captive who serves the very God that Belshazzar is mocking. God really does know how to humble the pride. He's pretty good at it. But before Daniel gives the interpretation, he gives Belshazzar a little history lesson to lay the groundwork for the interpretation. He reminds Belshazzar of his predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, who also had a problem with pride. Verse 18, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations of men of every language dreaded and feared him. It says God gave King Nebuchadnezzar glory and splendor. That's understatement. It's no exaggeration. The city of Babylon itself, which he owned, not even to count half the world, The city was magnificent. Within that city were 3 palaces, not one, with doors overlaid with gold, silver, colored tiles. There were statues. There was artwork scattered throughout the city. You have heard of the hanging gardens of Babylon? That's where they were. Waterfalls, terraces, trees, shrubs, walkways, like the Arboretum on steroids. That was his. And it says his power was great. Men of, not some nation, men of every nation feared him. Nebuchadnezzar was great because God made him great. Somewhere along the line, he decided to minimize God's contribution in his success and take the credit for himself. One day, King Nebuchadnezzar, as the king was walking on the royal palace, on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, you can picture that king up there. Listen what he says. Is this not Babylon the Great? I have built as my royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty. Not a good idea to say that. And the result of his pride, back in our chapter, verse 20, when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne, stripped of his glory, driven away from people, given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men, and he sets over them anyone he wishes. Daniel told Belshazzar this story to say essentially this. Nebuchadnezzar was dumb, but Belshazzar, you are even dumber. Nebuchadnezzar ignored God, but you have outright defied him. Nebuchadnezzar lost his sanity for 7 years. Let's see what happens to you. We read in verse 22, but you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent that hand that wrote the inscription. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And it's not good. Mene. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Guess what? No more days. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Belshazzar's character was placed on a scale and he didn't measure up. He was a moral lightweight. He was found deficient, and the result, Perez or Parson, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Your kingdom has been divided from you, torn from you. And God wasn't kidding. Verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. You say, Steve, how on earth could that happen? How could anyone overcome those walls in such a short time? Here's what happened. History tells us that part of the Euphrates River flowed under the city to keep the city alive, provide water. The Persian army dug canals to divert that part of the river that lowered the water level. They were able to walk right on under the walls with their heads above water and pop up in the middle of the city. Belshazzar was promptly executed, and Babylon was subsumed by the Medes and the Persians without a fight, just like that. Turns out that Belshazzar was not quite as invincible as he thought. He's no match for God. He was no match for God. Those who walk in pride, God is able to humble. That story was undoubtedly encouraging to the Jews who were living in exile as they read that story. It was encouraging them who lived under godless rulers to know that God can take care of those matters. And it's encouraging for us as believers as well. We learn from this story there's not a man, woman, nation on earth that can build walls strong enough to avoid the judgment of God. That means even Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea, is doomed unless he repents, and I hope he does. He may live out his 90 years and face God then, or he may choke on a noodle tonight and face God then. But either way, he'll be humbled. True, evil's doing real good in our world today, and God's people are suffering, we're laughed at, we're persecuted, and some are even killed. True, we may lose many battles along the way, but my friends, we will ultimately win the war. We're on the winning team, guys. You notice Belshazzar at the end of this story, where's he? Dead. Who's the last man standing? Daniel. The first will be last, the last will be first. There's a great reversal coming for all mankind. All those who oppose God will be humbled, and all those who walk humbly with God will be elevated. Guys, let's take that to the bank. Let's lock that down. So how are we to respond to a culture that defies God? We're not to despair. We don't need to despair. And we're definitely not to blend in. Rather, we're to trust that God will humble the proud in his time. That's the first answer to the question. And here's the second. As believers, we are to make sure that we ourselves remain humble before God. We've just seen that God will deal with all those proud people out there in the world. That's his job. Our job is to deal with the one proud person looking at us in the mirror. Now, I doubt that anybody in this room will ever deteriorate to the level of King Belshazzar, who essentially spit in God's face. But I know from personal experience it is very easy for us to become like King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar took credit for the good things in his life. He patted himself on the back rather than praising God. And as we've seen, that's a dangerous place to put ourselves in. Believers, we are not immune from becoming proud, and believers, we are not immune from the consequences of becoming proud either. All those who walk in pride, God is able to humble. We ourselves must remain humble before God. I am looking at some pretty successful people. Seriously, you are a great gang. You're hard workers. You pay your bills. Some of you have saved money for the future. You guys have maintained good relationships. You've got long-time friendships. You get along with your family. These are no small accomplishments. Many of you are good students. You get good grades. You play an instrument. You're good at sports. Take care of your health. You're not in trouble with the law. You've got a roof over your head. You all have a car that actually started this morning and drove you across town. Many of you serve in meaningful ways here at church or at your workplace or in your neighborhoods. You're having an impact. And I look at the kids in our church. They have glasses, they have braces, they have nice clothes, they're pretty, groomed, everything. You guys are in so many ways very successful. We have all accomplished some things of value. Okay, I have two questions for us on that, related to that. Let's go back. Why was Nebuchadnezzar successful? Hard work? Undoubtedly. Natural ability? Of course. It's hard to be successful without hard work and ability. But that's not the primary reason Nebuchadnezzar was successful. The Bible tells us why he achieved what he did. We just read it. Your father Nebuchadnezzar achieved sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor because of God. O King, the Most High God gave your father that. And because of the high position he gave him, all the nations of men feared him. God gave. God gave. He was successful because of the kindness of God. It was a gift from God. Now let me ask you the most important question. Why are you successful? Why have you achieved what you've achieved? Very same answer. Because of the kindness of God. Even our ability to work hard and our innate talent, our inborn talent, are gifts from God. Anything and everything remotely good in our lives, from a PBJ to a PhD. How about that? I came up with that yesterday. I thought that was great. And every single thing in between is from above. Every good and perfect gift comes from above. Paul asked a rhetorical question in 1 Corinthians 4. He said, what do you have that you've not received? I'm listening. What do you have? Name something you have that you have not received. Nothing. Zero. Nothing. If it is good, it is from God. Period. Exclamation point. And it's not difficult to see. Not difficult to see. Why are you a good musician? Maybe you can play a good instrument. Why are you a good musician? Genetics, of course. You might have plugged into a band that had a really good director. And you had a mom who worked hard to buy you a trombone and cart you to lessons. All gifts from God. Why are you employed? Earning money, paying the bills. Because your IQ is high enough to do that job, and because that job was posted the day you went and applied. Gifts from God. Why are you strong and healthy today? Because your parents fed you 3 meals a day when you were a little child and took you to the doctor. And there were doctors who could treat you for strep throat that would have taken your life otherwise. Gifts from God. We are successful because of what we are given from Him. Even secular sociologists recognize that point. Malcolm Gladwell, in his very interesting book called Outliers, argues that success is far more than hard work and raw talent. While those things are essential, he argues there is always something else that has been given to an individual that enables him to achieve a measure of success. For instance, studies show that if you want to become a professional hockey player in Canada, and I know you do, you need to make sure that you're born in January, February, or March. Just make sure that's the case. Why? Because the eligibility date for a boy to join an age-class hockey team in Canada is January 1st. That means that a boy who turns 10 on January 2nd could be playing alongside of a boy who was born 10 months later in the year. And that age gap at that stage of their life is a huge advantage. The boy is bigger than his teammates. That bigger boy is noticed by the coach. He gets better equipment. He gets more ice time. He plays more games, and with those advantages, he's better poised to make it to the junior A league, and then on he goes from there to the big leagues. That boy becomes an elite professional athlete, not because he's better than the other boys, but because he was bigger than the other boys the day he started to play that sport, which was an advantage given to him. Nobody determines his own birthday. And that's just one example he writes about among many. Success in sports, music, business, technology, educational achievements, you name it, there is always a component other than hard work and raw talent. And we as believers own the fact that even hard work and raw talent is a gift from God. All that to say this: you and I have no legitimate reason to take credit for our accomplishments. We can be thankful, but we better not be proud. We took a trip east a couple weeks ago to visit my mom and dad and some family. And I was talking to my niece's son. And I said, "How's it going in your career?" He works with electricity. And he said, "I am a journeyman now." I said, "Good night." He oversees big projects as a journeyman, and he oversees a whole bunch of people putting in electrical things in big buildings. I said, she's only 26 years old. 26, that's quite an accomplishment. I said, way to go. And he responded the proper way. He said, Steve, I am blessed. And he went on to say, I was at work one day, and a master electrician noticed me and said, I'd like to apprentice you. And because of that, I'm blessed. I'm blessed. He recognized that his success was a gift from God. Nebuchadnezzar forgot that. He said, is this not Babylon I have built? And sadly, we forget it too. But pride's not easy to detect. Pride is like a very sneaky, deadly snake that quietly slithers into the tall grass and lays there. And a little while later moves closer to its prey silently until pounces. I chewed on this. How can we tell if that deadly snake has slithered into the grass of our lives? How can we detect it? In my opinion, as I chewed on it, I think the single best way to detect pride is to evaluate how we view other people. Not how we treat other people, but how we view them. Other people who we might deem less successful than ourselves. I believe that that is the litmus test for pride in our own lives. I need to share a story with you that I don't want to share with you, but it reveals my own struggle with pride. We're all in this together, right? Okay. I was grocery shopping up the road at Kroger. My routine, a while back, I headed down the coffee aisle and I saw a woman and her little daughter. The woman was dressed in ugly clothes. Clothes didn't fit, clothes didn't match. Her hair looked like a rat's nest, looked like she hadn't combed or washed it in weeks. She was screaming rudely at her little daughter who was getting into something. Keep your hands off of that. Get over here. And as I squeezed by with my cart, I caught a whiff of her, and she stunk. I didn't mistreat her. I didn't say anything unkind. In fact, as I rolled on by, I nodded and smiled. But I need to tell you what I was thinking in my mind. I was thinking to myself, that woman is disgusting. I'm surprised I made it out of Kroger that day, because God had every right to take me out for that condescending attitude toward her, because from his perspective, there was one other person in Kroger far more disgusting than that woman. It was me, because of that attitude. Who am I? Who do I think I am? I'd bet $1,000 that that woman did not have parents like I did and do. I doubt she had a mom that made sure that she wore the right clothes to school and that she brushed her teeth and combed her hair and took a bath every night like I did. I doubt she had a kind father who spoke gently when the child was out of line like I did. And I doubt she had parents that took her to Sunday school and introduced her to Jesus like I did. That woman was simply not given what I was given. Period. So what right do I have to look down on her? If it weren't for the kindness of God, I would be in her shoes. I would look like her, I'd dress like her, I'd smell like her, and I'd treat my children like she did. I'm no better than that woman. In fact, if I maintain an attitude like I had in that day, I'm worse than her. Jesus cared for women like that. But Jesus was not very fond of people who have an attitude like I did. Guys, our job as followers of the Lord Jesus is not to look down on people. Our job is to love people and to give God the praise for every doggone good thing in our lives. And the day we forget it is the day that we're inviting God to take it all away. those who walk in pride, God is able to humble. And you know who said those words? Nebuchadnezzar, when he came to his senses. And he knew what he was talking about. Life's tough enough as it is without signing up to make it worse. I don't know about you, but I don't want to see any handwriting on my wall. And I doubt you do either. So how are we to live in a culture that defies God? We're to trust that God will humble the proud in his time. That's an encouragement. We're also to make sure that we ourselves remain humble before him. And that's a warning. May God help us all to adjust our lives to his word. Amen? Amen. It's been a pleasure being with you.